Have you ever felt a chill crawl up your spine for no apparent reason? Ever had a moment when the hair on the back of your neck stood on end, warning you of unseen danger? What you're about to hear will make you question those moments of unease. These stories tap into the primal fears we've all felt but rarely speak of. Driving late at night has always been my preference. The roads are quieter, the air feels calmer, and the tips are better. I've been a nighttime rideshare driver for a few years now, and while the job has had its fair share of odd passengers, nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that night. It started like any other shift. My beat-up 2005 Volvo rattled along the streets, its occasional creaks and groans keeping me company in the silence. The streets were deserted, just the way I liked them. Around 2 a.m., I got a ride request from a convenience store nearby. It seemed harmless enough, but as I drove toward the location, an unsettling feeling crept in. You know that gut instinct that tells you something isn't right, even when there's no logical reason to feel that way. That's what hit me. I couldn't explain it, but a strange heaviness seemed to fill the air as I approached the store. The first sign that something was off was the store itself. It was completely dark, closed for the night. The parking lot was empty, not a single car in sight. I slowed down, scanning the area, and that's when I saw him. A man was pacing outside the store, his hooded figure illuminated by my headlights. He wore a ragged hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. The fabric was frayed, with a hole in the sleeve, and his movements were erratic, almost twitchy. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he thought someone was following him. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to cancel the ride and drive away. My hand hovered over the cancel button, but for reasons I still can't explain, I didn't press it. Against my better judgment, I stopped the car and unlocked the doors. He slid into the back seat without saying a word. The moment I started driving, I knew I'd made a mistake. Most passengers either scroll through their phones or stare out the window, lost in their own world. Not this guy. He sat upright, his eyes locked on me through the rearview mirror. His gaze was unnerving, intense, unblinking. It was like he was studying me, analyzing every move I made. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes boring into me. To break the uncomfortable silence, I turned on the radio, hoping some background noise would help. But as soon as the music started, he snapped at me to turn it off. His voice was low and raspy, the kind of voice that immediately makes you think of a lifelong smoker. The sharpness in his tone startled me, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Without a word, I turned the radio off, the silence now even heavier than before. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. Who was this guy? What was his deal? I told myself to stay calm, to just get him to his destination and move on. Then he spoke. Ever pick up someone you shouldn't have? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I let out a nervous laugh, trying to keep things light. Well, I hope not, I said, glancing at him in the mirror. He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and muttered something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill down my spine. He began rambling, talking about how he used to be a rideshare driver. His words were slurred, and his sentences didn't always make sense, but I managed to piece together the gist of his story. He said he'd quit driving after some passengers stole from him. What unnerved me the most wasn't his story. It was the way he told it. He smiled the entire time, a wide, unsettling grin that didn't match the content of his words. It was the kind of smile you'd expect from someone reminiscing about a happy memory, not from someone recounting a bad experience. He ended his story with a comment that made my blood run cold. It's funny how much trust people put in someone sitting right behind them. I felt my pulse quicken. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't respond. What could I say to that? The air in the car felt suffocating. I glanced at the GPS, silently willing the destination to appear sooner. But the man wasn't done talking. He continued rambling, his words a mix of nonsense and deeply unsettling statements. Some of it sounded like gibberish, but other parts made me wonder what he was capable of. At one point, he started apologizing. Not to me, though. I'm not even sure who he was talking to. He kept saying, "I didn't mean it," over and over, his voice growing more frantic with each repetition. We were only a few minutes away from his destination when he suddenly yelled that I'd missed a turn. I knew I hadn't. The GPS clearly showed we were on track, but his outburst startled me so much that I hit the brakes. He demanded that I pull over. My hands were shaking as I shifted into park. That's when I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. A police car was slowly approaching, its spotlight sweeping across the road. The man in my back seat immediately slouched down, trying to stay out of sight. My heart was pounding as I watched the police car pass us, its lights briefly illuminating the interior of my car. The man stayed crouched down for what felt like an eternity. I didn't dare move or say anything. Then finally, he sat up and looked at me through the mirror. "You're lucky," he said, his voice low and cold. Before I could respond, he opened the door and disappeared into the night. I sat there for a moment, frozen, before I finally managed to drive away. I ended my shift early that night. The experience had shaken me to my core. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned just how dangerous that encounter had been. I came across a news article about a robbery that had taken place at a convenience store, the same store where I'd picked up that passenger. The realization made my stomach drop. I had been inches away from someone who could have hurt me, someone who might have been running from the law. To this day, I think about that night and what could have happened if things had gone differently. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like and share this video. There's more to come, and you won't want to miss it. After living through a traumatic event in the city, I knew I needed a change. The urban chaos had taken its toll, and I found myself craving silence. True, uninterrupted silence. I wanted to escape the noise, the crowds, and the constant hum of city life. That's how I ended up in a remote cabin tucked deep into the woods of Oregon. The listing was exactly what I was looking for: isolation, peace, and quiet. It was the kind of place where you could hear the wind rustling through the trees and nothing else. The cabin was small but sturdy, with thick wooden beams and an old stone fireplace that gave it a timeless charm. When I first stepped inside, I was greeted by the scent of pine and aged books, a smell so comforting it immediately put me at ease. The nearest neighbor, according to the listing, was about a 10-minute walk down a narrow, overgrown path. That sounded perfect to me. I didn't plan on needing or meeting anyone. For the first few days, I reveled in the solitude. I woke up to birdsong instead of car horns, and at night, the only sound was the wind brushing against the cabin walls. It felt like the entire world had paused, allowing me to finally breathe again. It wasn't until about a week after I moved in that I met Michelle. The knock on my door startled me. This cabin didn't have a doorbell, and I hadn't been expecting anyone. I opened the door to find an older woman standing there, holding a basket of preserves. She looked like she'd stepped out of a Hallmark movie, complete with long gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. Michelle introduced herself as my nearest neighbor. She handed me the basket without waiting for me to accept it. her movements as sharp and deliberate as her words. "Welcome to the woods," she said, her voice flat but not unfriendly. I thanked her and took the basket, feeling slightly awkward. I wasn't used to such directness. There was something about her that felt off. She wasn't rude, but her demeanor was so blunt that it bordered on unsettling. Before she left, she gave me a piece of advice that I'll never forget. "Always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." Her words hung in the air like a warning. I nodded politely and watched as she turned and walked back down the path. For a long moment, I stood there, listening to her footsteps fade into the distance. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in, something rare, but not unheard of in Oregon. The sound of rain against the cabin roof was oddly soothing, and I spent the evening curled up with a book, the flickering glow of candles lighting the room. Everything was peaceful until the knock at the door. It wasn't a gentle knock. It was loud, insistent, and completely out of place against the backdrop of the storm. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, listening. Grabbing a flashlight, I cautiously approached the door. Peeking through the narrow window pane, I saw Michelle standing on the porch, soaked to the bone. I opened the door, and before I could say a word, she blurted out, "I saw someone near your woodpile. I thought you should know." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I stepped outside, shining my flashlight toward the woodpile, but the rain made it nearly impossible to see anything. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the storm. She nodded, her eyes darting nervously toward the woods. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. Something about the encounter didn't sit right with me. How could she have seen my woodpile from her cabin, which was a 10-minute walk away? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Was she lying? And if so, why? I locked the door and spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every creak and gust of wind. The following night, I woke up to the sound of snapping branches just outside my bedroom window. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear more. Summoning what little courage I had, I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing, but then, in the faint moonlight, I spotted her. Michelle was standing at the edge of the woods, her long hair wild and disheveled. She was facing away from the cabin, her body angled toward the trees. I ducked back beneath the window, my mind racing. What was she doing out there in the middle of the night? When I finally mustered the courage to look again, she was gone. The next morning, I decided to confront her. I followed the narrow path to her cabin, my nerves on edge. But when I arrived, I was met with a sight that stopped me in my tracks. The cabin was abandoned. The windows were cracked. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the entire structure was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. It looked like no one had lived there in years. My stomach churned as I stood there, staring at the decaying building. I thought about Michelle's warnings, her strange behavior, and the eerie encounters of the past few nights. None of it made sense. I went back to my cabin, locked every door and window, and spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew the woods held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. What do you think Michelle really wanted? Was she trying to help, or was something more sinister at play? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy, warmth, and family, but for me, that night turned into a memory I'll never forget, and not the good kind. My girlfriend, Catherine and I had developed a small tradition over the past few years. Since her family lived just a couple of hours from mine, we'd always spend Christmas Eve with my family and then drive through the night to her house for Christmas Day. The route we took was a quiet one, mostly back roads cutting through snow-covered fields and dense forests. It was serene, peaceful even, a perfect end to the holiday festivities. This past Christmas Eve started just like the others. After a warm evening filled with laughter and food at my family's house, we packed up the car around midnight and hit the road. Snow was falling lightly, the roads were empty, and the car's heater was working overtime against the chill outside. Everything felt perfect. As always, we played our favorite music. Juice WRLD had become a staple for these late-night drives. There was something about singing along to the lyrics together that made the world feel like ours alone. The rhythm, the quiet of the night, and Catherine's smile made the drive something I looked forward to every year. But this time, the silence of the night wasn't comforting. It became suffocating. About 30 minutes into the drive, my phone began to ring. I glanced down at the screen, annoyed that someone would call me so late. The number was unknown. I ignored it, assuming it was just another scam call. I joked to Catherine about how persistent those scammers must be, even on Christmas, and she laughed. But the phone rang again a few minutes later. It was the same unknown number. This time, I felt a twinge of irritation. I let it go to voicemail again, hoping that would be the end of it. Catherine raised an eyebrow at me and said, "That's weird," her voice tinged with unease. I shrugged it off, though I couldn't help but feel a slight tension creeping into the car. And then, not even 2 minutes later, the phone rang for the third time. This time, I was angry. Slapping the steering wheel in frustration, I grabbed my phone and answered with more force than was necessary. "Hello?" My voice was sharp, almost shouting. For a moment, there was nothing but static. I was about to hang up when a voice spoke, cutting through the static like a knife. "Hello, Luke." The voice was calm, almost casual, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as my heart began to race. I didn't recognize the voice, and yet it felt like the person on the other end knew me well. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The man ignored my question. Instead, he began reciting details about my life, details no stranger should know. He said my full name, my address, and even mentioned where Catherine and I had spent Christmas Eve. My blood ran cold. I glanced at Catherine, who was now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She mouthed, "Who is it?" But I could only shake my head. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound confident. The man paused, and then he said something that made my stomach drop. "I'm not here for you, Luke. I'm here for Catherine." Hearing her name come from that voice was like a punch to the gut. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I tried to think of a response, but nothing came. The man chuckled softly, his tone dripping with malice. "She's sitting right next to you, isn't she?" That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I swerved the car to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, trying to process what was happening. Before I could say anything, Catherine reached over and ended the call. "What are you doing?" I yelled, my voice cracking from the mix of fear and anger. "Why did you hang up?" "I don't know," she shouted back, tears streaming down her face. "I was scared, okay?" I stared at her, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to call the number back, but another part of me didn't want to hear that voice again. The rest of the drive was silent. The music stayed off, and neither of us spoke. My mind was spinning with questions. Who was that man? How did he know so much about us? And most importantly, what did he want with Catherine? When we finally arrived at her family's house, the relief was short-lived. Even in the warmth of her parents' home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. For weeks after that night, I waited for the phone to ring again. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat, but the man never called back. I've gone over that night in my head countless times, trying to make sense of it. Was it a cruel prank? A coincidence? Or was it something darker? Catherine and I never spoke about it again, but the fear lingers. And every time I get into my car, I can't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to hear that voice again. If this story left you on edge, make sure to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the notification bell. You don't want to miss what's coming next.